have in this world is my balls and my word, and I don't break them for no one. Do you understand?
Because I've got very, very big testicles, Poppy.
Yay, my first Canadian profile. This is my house. Professor Godsad's work has become my personal cleansing retreat for when I read the Canadian news and the vein starts to throb in my forehead, which is basically every single fricking day. You're going to notice I'm swearing a lot less in this video. It's because when I think about Professor Saad, the swearing part of my brain sort of shuts off and I'm in Mary Janes and pigtails again. It would be like swearing in front of Santa, if Santa was the Dos Equis guy. Seriously, he's one of the only people I can name for whom the term beloved really fits. Just read his Facebook. Even his SJW castrato mingers provide fodder for epic smackdowns that just make people love the Godfather more. I apologize for the quality of my voice in this video. I spent the weekend at an event screaming my head off and have kind of lost my voice. I've just gotten it back now. But hopefully you'll overlook the fact that I'm kind of rocking the Diana crawl. If you're just tuning in now, the SJW Rehab series features a series of speakers I want to introduce not just as a potential signal boost, but also specifically in terms of demonstrated strengths and approaches that can be adapted by anyone trying to disengage from the SJW headspace and come to a position based more in objective truth, reason, and reality. When you can lock down the things other people are doing that are working, you can turn those principles to work for you, regardless of differences in specific ideology. I'm not doing anything new here. It's just a YouTube intellectual version of watching rugby footage to figure out how not to get your ear ripped off next time. I was intending to profile Professor Saad a bit later on in the series, but as sometimes happens, Aldebaran moved in the sky, the stars aligned, and so I bumped him up. Some really compelling responses have come out of my recent videos, as well as some conversations I've had in my personal real-life circles. A lot of people are expressing that they want to do something, but aren't sure about the wisest way to go about it. The issue of balancing the need to make your voice heard with the realistic consequences for doing so is a huge turd in the punch bowl. And then the cherry on this sundae was a recent video by my favorite dashing Teutonic provocateur, Top Hats and Champagne, challenging YouTubers who rail against the SJW culture, but who choose to keep their real identities hidden. I'll get into those a bit later. But right now, take your hat in your hand, shine your shoes, and let us request an audience with the Godfather. So, Professor Godsad. He's an academic heavyweight who basically does everything.
Yes, does everything.
Mathematics, computer science, business, psych. Reading off a complete list of his accomplishments would take up the entirety of this video, and you would probably fall asleep. I'd probably fall asleep. So I'll try to sum it up as succinctly as possible. Dr. Godsad is currently Professor of Marketing at the John Molson School of Business here in Canada and holds the Concordia University Research Chair in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences and Darwinian Consumption. He's Associate Editor of Evolutionary Psychology and Customer Needs and Solutions and is an Advisory Fellow at the Centre for Inquiry here in the Great White North. He's written a ton of scientific articles, several books, which I'll link to below as always, and has served on the boards of about a skillion different journals. Outside of all the teaching and writing and his public profile, he's a pretty keen scientist in his own right. I can only assume he's developed some kind of Hermione-esque time overlap machine on the sly in order to do all these things under current quantum limitations. I get a bouncy little squee every time he talks about how scientists must maintain a degree of doubt and humility, because I literally break out in fricking hives every time someone says, "The science is settled." No, you... Please, if you're listening, plug your ears, Santa Saad. No, you moronic fucktard. The science is never settled by epistemological definition unless you are an utter narcissist or you're lining your bank account. But anyway, on a personal bio note for him, he was born in Beirut and moved to Montreal, Quebec, here in Canada, to escape the Lebanese Civil War. This is important, I think, as while Dr. Saad's blog entries and interviews reflect a strong desire to target oppression in a very clear and rational way, even with the Santa effect, I always hear the lion roaring behind his voice when he takes on the SJW bullpucky. The first time I listened to him, I knew this was a man who understands war and the realities of the glory and the madness of human nature. My own father spent much of his childhood in the shelters of World War II, listening to the air raid sirens overhead, and so I have a nose for people who have seen those horrors. I'm going to skip over the blah blah evil Jews stuff, because even in his own interviews, he is perfectly happy to hear Israel criticized. And while Professor Saad has been criticized in an academic sense, I'll be frank that I'm not enough of an expert in this field to determine the validity of that criticism. If you have more chops in this, I invite you to comment and tell me why you think he's full of poop. Poop. I meant poop. However, where Professor Saad really shines is in his interviews. He doesn't dumb down, he doesn't interrupt, and he doesn't only seek other academics. His interviews are full of jokes and colloquialisms, and they never feel like a lecture I'm sitting through, looking at the clock, hoping I will have a grand mal seizure so I have a legitimate reason to get out of it. He manages to straddle precise academic language with connecting with non-academic guests, perhaps best illustrated in a recent interview with Tommy Robinson, who, while a well-spoken and intelligent man, is also kind of a self-confessed yobbo. I don't mean that pejoratively. He's a working-class Lutonite and has never pretended to be anything but. My point is that I adore Professor Saad's ability to completely shred the idea of the so-called elite classes having inherently more value. Ever notice that some of the most strident voices complaining about privilege are actually the most privileged themselves? Yep, me too. A user named DuneBuggy12 echoed this in my comments section, and thank you for the contribution, writing, "A lot of SJWs are high IQ'd, well-intentioned people, something about evolutionarily novel ideas, Angela Merkel for one. This makes it even more discerning, because we are just as susceptible of falling to dark side." I'm nerding out. That's okay, I like the nerd. As we fight against this new enemy, we need to be careful not to use the same rhetoric, and at the same time, be wary of those of us that will. Yes! There is a tacit belief that education and high IQ, in an academic sense, grants validity as an elite class, and that's reinforced internally. Just look at the "liberals are smart, conservatives are dumb" memes. But even as an obviously high IQ'd academic, Dr. Saad challenges this. So Professor Saad's interview with Tommy Robinson, while not only excellent on its own merits, and I highly recommend watching the whole thing, it's also a silver platter for the concept I want to put forward in this episode of SJW Rehab, the idea of discretion versus valor. Both Professor Saad and Tommy Robinson are out in the public sphere, although Tommy Robinson is a nom de pegida, fight, bellum, I don't know. It's his war face. Still, they're both perfectly identifiable in a face-to-name context. While Professor Saad is open about the bulwark he has against censure due to tenure and academic renown, Tommy is equally open about the censures he's suffered due to his rather blunt and plain speech condemnation of the multitude of factors leading to things like Rotherham. If you're not familiar with Rotherham yet, it was a cluster frig of PC pressure combined with both the bold cultural differences of Islam compared with Western Moors, the failure of trusted authorities to act, and the end result of the push-pull of competing interests. It was a white squall of the worst that Islamist thought has to offer, combined with the utter pusillanimous weakness of the guilty, white, wealthy, privileged bureaucracy to oppose it. And this is why criticisms like top hats and champagnes are so important. even when they indirectly target me. Side note, I adore Top Hats and Champagne, especially his Brain Drain series. He is fearless, witty, and he appeals to my screwdriver for breakfast side. And he's simply raised the other side of the coin to what Professor Saad and Tommy Robinson reference in this video, that the possible consequences of speaking out need to be balanced against the rewards for doing so, and that a filter of cowardice is part of what allows these evils to bloom. I tend to shy away from making this series too much about me. I'm a nobody, and personal anecdotes are not data anyway. But there are professions, as opposed to jobs, wherein you take both explicit and implicit oaths to maintain a degree of public neutrality. Police, lawyers, doctors, judges, military, politicians, even untenured academics. These are my circles in my real life. Even just as a student, my fingers are in all of those pies. For these professions, it is not so easy to just quit a job and find another. It's a profession you carry with you. We have taken oaths to maintain a certain degree of decorum publicly in everyone's public interest. Most critical thinkers no more want a police officer publicly saying black people are the root of all evil because of IQ differentials than they would want a police officer publicly saying black people are inherently oppressed and so need extra privileges to lift them up. But there is a restless undercurrent. Even when it's impossible, given our duties and obligations, to shout our personal views from a bullhorn, that does not mean we are on board with the direction things are going. Not all of us, anyway. So for some in this position, YouTube and other forums like it becomes like Daredevil. Lawyer by day, vigilante by night. I'm probably more like the night nurse. And this is why it's so crucial, if you're genuinely interested in tearing down the SJW pogrom and hopefully doing some good on a larger scale, to identify your platform. Once you know that, you can determine where your discretion and valor line should be drawn. What is your better part? Oh, discretion and valor. I struggled so much with this before deciding even to make my own tiddly little videos. And it's been reflected in a very thoughtful and challenging back and forth with a user on my Twitter feed named Taylor Machnick. Yep, I have his permission. In a conversation about when and where and how to speak up, he wrote, "I want to be careful that I am understood. My positions are moderate and I think sensible, and I am willing to be wrong." I drink from this pool of thought myself, but what is left unsaid, due to the limitations of Twitter, is the high probability that no matter how moderate or sensible or clear a position can be stated, there will always be those taking statements, twisting them, and using them to further their own agenda. In this way, even rock solid for the good statements can be used to do harm against the very people they're intended to champion. Where are our priorities, and where do we do the most good and the least harm? Being really honest about my own shortcomings, I'm never going to be a Lauren Southern, or a Christina Hoff Summers, or a Karen Strawn. But I'm pretty sanguine about this, because my priority is being someone working behind the scenes, off YouTube, in real life, for the same goals, just quietly. Top Hats and Champagne is correct. I am afraid, but not of doxing. I'm afraid that if I'm derailed now, I won't be in a position to do widespread good from within the system later. The platform I've chosen to do the most good is in the real-life things I already do, and I'm committed to continuing. Charity, medicine, law. I think it's utter bullshit that the SJW narrative gets a pass for suggesting things that the perceived right cannot get away with. But as so often happens, what used to be considered the underdog is now the master holding the whip, and free speech is not. The punishment for speaking out right now, as perhaps it's always been when a culture is on the cusp of revolt and revolution, ranges from the mere inconveniences of doxing and swatting to loss of jobs and income, all the way up to being hacked to death So I think to do any real good, both valor and discretion are critical. Top Hats and Champagne is correct in identifying fear, and if his video pisses you off, I'd encourage you to think about why. I am afraid of becoming a pawn for the regressive left. I don't trust that my public voice will always be filtered through the nuts and bolts of Socratic argument and reason. Were I ever held up as an example of how my authoritative field has gone so wrong, I become a weapon against the very freedoms I support, and I would have utterly failed in all of my goals. And so, I'm a bunny here. And even were I doxxed, I would still be a bunny here. But I promise you, I'm a lioness in my real life. I'm the same person here as I am in my everyday negotiations. I simply use different language, and I am perfectly happy to game the game from behind enemy lines. Trust me, you want sneaky bastards like me as your doctors and lawyers and police officers and soldiers, because we're in the real-world trenches, even if you're never going to know our names. History is full of quiet people shaping the course of society. Do you intend to become a renowned media polemicist? In that case, yeah, you're going to have to show your face and reveal your name. But are you a behind-the-scenes Mata Hari lobbyist type? In that case, no, restraint and strategy are probably going to serve your cause better. But maybe your platform is just that you're determined to teach your children how to think critically, not to swallow everything they see in the media or are taught at school. And all of these platforms are valid and crucial. But really, I agree with Top Hats and Champagne in this. Pick a platform and commit to it. The SJW debate can so often fall to entertaining low-hanging fruit. And as much as no, don't get me wrong, I totally enjoy the entertainment shits and giggles of funny response videos, I do think it's worth evaluating whether you're just capitalizing on going for the joke or taking steps toward tangibly changing the cultural narrative. You can do both. It's a big world out there beyond YouTube. What do you stand for? And where are you going? During an open question session, I asked the YouTube user Vernaculus. If you're not familiar with him, he's a rising star in the YouTube stratosphere. Absolutely razor sharp. I'll link him in the low bar. But I asked him where he saw himself in the future. He replied, quote, "I hope to be published in print eventually, but so far my efforts have fallen flat. All I can do is elucidate my opinions and correct faulty information. I'm willing to do this pro bono until the day I die. So if people want to support me for that, that would be extremely beneficial. I would love to eventually get enough notoriety to publicly speak somewhere." End quote. Fuck yeah. This hits every note of the idea of platforming that I'm presenting here. He has an arc, he's already come forward with his real name and face, he has a sense of where he wants to take his arguments. This is platforming, and he is playing the long game. Both Professor Saad and Tommy Robinson recognize and show empathy for those who aren't in a position to weather the slings and arrows of irrational, yet predictable consequence, given that the Social Justice Brigade are now holding the paddle. Shit is real, and has been for a very long time. But every voice has the potential to inspire others, whether you're a bear or a brain, or a godfather. If you really want to make change and aren't just in it for the lulz, figure out your platform and make it work. I suspect that at least the YouTubers I watch regularly who choose to remain anonymous, most already have and are doing just that. Thank you so much for listening. Oh, and yeah, I signed Sargon's petition, because that's part of my platforming.